I was sitting at a polished oak table with 12 people watching me when my mother-in-law smiled and said, "You know, Emily never made Daniel look this uncomfortable." And just like that, the entire room shifted against me, subtle at first, then sharper, like I had walked into something planned long before I arrived, and no one, not even my husband, said a single word to stop it. Not when his sister laughed under her breath, not when his brother added that Emily fit better with this family, and definitely not when his father quietly nodded, as if confirming a truth everyone had already agreed on. If this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now, because I want to know who's here with me in this moment. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 41 years old, and that dinner was the night everything in my marriage and in that family changed in a way none of them saw coming. It started earlier that evening, in a house that never really felt like mine, even after 3 years of marriage, where every dinner felt less like a gathering and more like a quiet evaluation I was never meant to pass, where the walls held framed photos of Daniel's past, including one of him and Emily, that somehow never got taken down, and where every conversation had this careful, polite tone that could turn cold in seconds, like it did that night, when Linda Carter leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine slowly, and brought up Emily again, casually at first, like she was reminiscing, saying how graceful she had been, how she always knew what to say, how she made everyone feel comfortable. And then she looked at me, just for a second, and added, "Some people just have that natural touch." And I felt it, that shift, that unspoken comparison settling over the table, and I didn't react. I just nodded slightly, kept my hand still, because I had learned that reacting only made it worse in this house. But then Daniel's younger sister, Chloe, leaned forward with a small smile and said, "Emily used to host dinners like this all the time, didn't she?" And someone chuckled, and I saw Daniel glance down at his plate, his jaw tightening just slightly. But he still said nothing, not one word to redirect it, not even a simple, "That's enough." And that silence said more than anything else in that room. It told me exactly where I stood, or maybe where I didn't. And as the conversation kept circling back to Emily, to her perfect timing, her soft personality, her way of understanding Daniel, I realized this wasn't just casual talk. This was a message, carefully delivered in pieces, and I was expected to sit there and absorb it, to accept that I was the wrong choice without anyone having to say it directly. And I did sit there. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just held my glass, felt the cool surface against my fingers, and listened, because there was something else building underneath all of it, something none of them noticed. Not the way I glanced at the clock on the wall more than once, not the way I stayed too calm, too quiet, like I was waiting for something they couldn't see yet. And even as Linda finally leaned forward and said, in a tone that sounded almost gentle, "Daniel has always deserved someone who truly understands his world." I didn't answer. I just looked at her, then at Daniel, and then back at my glass, because I knew something they didn't, something that hadn't walked through that door yet, but was already on its way. I did not respond to Linda, and that seemed to make things worse, because silence in that house was never seen as strength. It was seen as weakness, like an open invitation for them to keep going, and Chloe took it, leaning back in her chair with a small, knowing smile and saying, "Emily used to remember everyone's preferences, even the small things, like how Dad likes his steak medium rare, not medium." And Robert gave a quiet nod, almost approving, like he was being reminded of something valuable that had been lost. And I noticed how Daniel's hand tightened slightly around his fork, just for a second, but he still did not say anything. He did not defend me. He did not redirect the conversation. He just stayed there, quiet, like he was hoping it would pass on its own. And that silence felt heavier than any word they could have said, because it told me he was choosing comfort over me, choosing their approval over standing beside his wife, and I felt it settle in my chest, not sharp, not sudden, but slow, like something sinking deeper than it should. And Linda continued, her voice soft but deliberate. "It is not about comparison, Sarah. It is just that some people naturally understand how to be part of a family." And she smiled at me like she was being kind, like she was offering advice instead of judgment. And I nodded once, just once, because I knew if I spoke, even calmly, it would turn into something else, something louder, something messier. And that was exactly what they would expect from someone they already believed did not belong. And across the table, Daniel finally looked up. But not at me. He looked at his mother, then at his father, and said quietly, "Let us just have dinner." And for a moment, it almost sounded like he was trying to end it, but the way he avoided my eyes told me everything I needed to know. It was not about protecting me, it was about keeping the peace. And keeping the peace in that family always meant letting me take the hit. And then his older brother Mark laughed softly and said, "We are just talking, no need to be sensitive." And that word, sensitive, landed heavier than the rest because it reframed everything. It made it sound like I was the problem, even though I had not said a single word, and I could feel every pair of eyes at that table measuring me, waiting to see if I would react, if I would prove their point. And I did not give them that. I just adjusted my posture slightly, straightened my back, and took a slow breath, focusing on something small, the sound of the air conditioning, the faint clink of silverware, anything that would keep me grounded in that moment. And then Linda leaned forward again, resting her elbows lightly on the table, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel more personal, more direct, and she said, "Daniel has always needed someone who understands his responsibilities. His world is not simple." And this time, she did not mention Emily. She did not have to. The comparison was already there, fully formed, hanging in the air between us. And I finally looked up at Daniel, really looked at him, waiting, just for a second, for something, anything, a word, a glance, a signal that he saw what was happening, that he understood what they were doing. But he only held my gaze for a brief moment before looking away again. And that was when something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet realization that settled into place, clear and steady, like a line being drawn that I had not fully acknowledged before. And I glanced at the clock again, just a quick look, but enough to confirm what I already knew. And as the conversation slowly moved on, as plates were passed and glasses were refilled, as if nothing significant had just happened, I stayed exactly where I was, calm, composed, and silent, because I was not waiting for their approval anymore. I was waiting for something else entirely, something that was already closer than any of them realized. The conversation did not really move on. It only changed shape, quieter on the surface, but sharper underneath, like everyone had already said what they needed to say. And now they were just waiting to see how I would carry it. And I could feel it in the way Chloe kept glancing at me between bites, in the way Mark smirked every time Daniel spoke, like he was measuring something invisible. And Daniel tried, in his own way, to shift the mood by asking his father about work, about some deal or meeting. But even that felt rehearsed, like a distraction that no one fully committed to. And Linda responded politely but briefly, her attention never really leaving me for long. And then she did something small that said everything. She reached for her glass, paused, and looked directly at me before saying, "So Sarah, what exactly do you do again these days?" And it sounded simple, almost casual, but there was something in her tone, something too light, too careful, like she already knew the answer and just wanted to hear me say it out loud in front of everyone. And I met her gaze for a second, then said calmly, "I work in operations," and I kept it short on purpose because I knew how this worked. I knew that giving more would only give them more space to twist it. And sure enough, Chloe let out a small laugh and said, "Operations? That sounds broad." And Mark added, "Is that like management or more like support?" And I could hear it, the subtle shift, the way they framed it, reducing it, making it sound smaller than it was. And Daniel finally looked at me then, like he wanted me to explain more, to clarify, to make it easier for them to understand. But he still did not speak for me. And I felt that same quiet pressure again, that expectation to justify myself, to earn a place at a table I had already been sitting at for 3 years. And I did not give in to it. I just nodded slightly and said, "It is a structured role," and left it there. And for a second, no one responded. And that silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, but not for me, not anymore, because I was not trying to fill it. I was letting it sit exactly where it belonged, and Linda leaned back again, exhaling softly, like she had just confirmed something to herself, and said, "Well, Emily always had a very clear career path, very defined. It made things easier to understand, and this time, no one laughed. But no one disagreed either. and I noticed Daniel shift in his seat, like he wanted to say something, but the moment passed before he could decide, and that was when I heard it. Faint at first, the sound of a car pulling up outside, tires on gravel, then stopping, and I did not look up right away. I did not react, because I had been expecting it. I had been counting the minutes without letting it show, and I could feel my heartbeat steady, not faster, not slower, just steady, like everything was finally aligning with something I had already accepted before I walked into that house. And inside, the conversation continued, lighter now, almost forced, as if they were trying to move past what had already been said, but it did not matter anymore. Not to me, because whatever they thought they understood about me, whatever conclusion they believed they had reached, it was about to be tested in a way none of them had prepared for. And as footsteps approached the front door, slow, deliberate, I placed my glass down gently on the table, not making a sound. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to look toward the entrance, just for a second, because I knew exactly what was about to walk through that door. The knock on the door was not loud, but it cut through the room in a way nothing else had that night, clean and precise, and every conversation stopped without anyone needing to say a word. And Robert looked toward the hallway first, his expression shifting slightly, more confused than concerned, while Linda straightened in her chair, her fingers still wrapped around her glass, frozen in place for just a second too long, and Daniel turned his head toward the sound, his brows pulling together like he was trying to place something that did not belong there. And I stayed exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my hands resting calmly on the table, because I had already imagined this moment before it happened. And then the second knock came, just as measured, just as controlled. And this time Robert pushed his chair back and stood up, the legs scraping softly against the floor, and he walked toward the front door with that same quiet authority he always carried in his own home. But there was something different now, something slower in his steps, like uncertainty had slipped in without him noticing. And from where I sat, I could hear the door open, followed by a brief pause, the kind that happens when someone unexpected is standing on the other side. And then Robert's voice, lower than before, more formal, asking, "Can I help you?" And there was a response, calm, steady, not loud, but it carried enough weight that even from the dining room, I could feel it shift the air. And a second later, footsteps entered the house, firm but unhurried, and Robert stepped back into view, not leading this time, but following slightly behind. And that alone was enough to make Linda sit up straighter, her eyes narrowing just a little, as she tried to understand who had just walked into her home without introduction. And then the man appeared in the doorway, dressed in uniform, clean, precise, every detail exactly in place. And he did not rush, he did not speak immediately. He simply paused at the edge of the room and looked around, not scanning in confusion, but observing, controlled, deliberate, and one by one, everyone at the table turned toward him, the shift happening in silence, like a wave moving through the room, and I could see it on their faces, the recognition not fully formed yet, but something close to it, something that made them sit a little straighter, speak a little less. And Daniel stood halfway, not fully rising from his chair, just enough to show uncertainty, and said, "Is everything okay?" But the man did not answer him, not yet. He kept his attention moving, slow, steady, until it stopped on me, and in that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, not because they understood what was happening, but because they could feel that something important was about to be said. And I met his gaze without hesitation, without surprise, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, the reason I had stayed silent through everything that had been said, the reason I had not defended myself, had not explained, had not corrected a single assumption. And the man took one step forward, just one, enough to close the distance slightly, and then he spoke, his voice clear, controlled, carrying across the room without effort. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell." And it was not a question. It was not uncertain. It was precise, like a fact being stated in a room that had just realized it had misunderstood something very important. And no one moved, no one spoke, and for the first time that night, every pair of eyes at that table turned to me, not with judgment, not with comparison, but with something else entirely, something closer to realization, even if they did not yet understand what it meant. For a second, no one reacted, like the words had not fully landed yet. like their meaning was still moving through the room, and I could see it in Daniel first, the way his expression shifted, confusion, giving way to something sharper, something closer to realization. And he slowly straightened in his chair, his eyes locked on me now, not avoiding, not distant, but searching, as if he was trying to match the woman he thought he knew with the name that had just been spoken out loud. And Linda's hand tightened slightly around her glass, the faintest movement, but enough to show that something inside her had changed, because this was not part of the picture she had built in her mind, not part of the quiet narrative she had been repeating all evening. And Mark leaned forward just a little, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by a careful silence, like he was recalculating everything he had said in the last hour. And Chloe, who had not stopped smiling all night, finally went still, her lips pressed together as she looked from me to the man in uniform and back again, trying to understand what she had missed. And Robert cleared his throat softly, stepping slightly to the side, almost instinctively giving the man more space, and that alone said more than any words could. Because in this house, Robert was the one who set the tone, and now, without saying it directly, he had already shifted it, and the man took another step forward, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. And his presence filled the room in a way that did not need explanation, and then he spoke again, his voice just as controlled as before. "Ma'am, I apologize for the interruption, but I was informed you might be here," and there was no uncertainty in the way he addressed me, no hesitation, just clarity. And I stood up slowly, not rushing, not making a show of it, just a simple movement that felt completely natural to me, even if it looked different to everyone else in that room. And for a brief moment, the distance between who they thought I was and who I actually was became visible, not through anything dramatic, but through something much quieter, the way I held myself, the way I met his gaze, the way I nodded once in acknowledgement. And I said, "At ease, General." And the words settled into the room like something heavy and undeniable, something that could not be explained away or softened. And I saw it hit them, one by one, not loudly, but deeply. And Daniel took a step back without realizing it, like his body reacted before his mind could catch up. And Linda's eyes widened just slightly, not in shock, but in something closer to disbelief, like she was trying to find a version of reality where this made sense without forcing her to rethink everything she had said. And Mark looked down at the table for a second, his earlier comments hanging somewhere in the silence, and Chloe glanced at her mother, then back at me, her expression uncertain for the first time that night, and the general continued, "We have been trying to reach you regarding the briefing scheduled for tomorrow morning." And his tone remained professional, direct, as if this were any other situation, any other place, and I nodded again. "I received the message," I said calmly. "I will be there." And there was a pause after that, not long, but enough. Enough for the room to fully absorb what had just happened, enough for every assumption, every comparison, every quiet judgment from earlier that evening to settle into something heavier, something harder to ignore. And no one spoke, not immediately, because there was nothing they could say that would fit into this moment without exposing what they had done before it. And I could feel their attention shift completely now, not questioning, not dismissing, but watching, trying to understand how they had misread me so completely. And for the first time that night, I was not the one being evaluated anymore. They were. In the weeks that followed that night, the house did not feel the same anymore, not because anything dramatic happened, but because something quiet had shifted, something that could not be undone once it was seen, and I stopped going there as often, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because for the first time, I understood that belonging is not something you prove. It is something you either feel or you do not. And Daniel and I had conversations we should have had long before that dinner, slow conversations, uncomfortable ones, where silence meant thinking instead of avoiding. And he admitted that he had seen what was happening for a long time, but chose not to confront it, not because he agreed with them, but because it was easier to stay quiet than to challenge the people he had always known. And I listened, not to judge him, but to decide what that meant for me. Because love without respect is not something you can build a life on, no matter how long you try. And I began setting boundaries, simple ones at first, where I would not stay in rooms where I was being diminished, where I would not explain myself to people who had already decided who I was, And those boundaries did not come with raised voices or dramatic exits. They came with calm decisions, with choosing when to leave, when to stay, and when to no longer participate. And slowly, things became quieter, not perfect, but clearer, and there is a kind of peace that comes from that clarity, a steady kind of peace that does not depend on other people understanding you. And if you are listening to this right now, and you have ever sat at a table where you felt small, where you felt compared, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside, I want you to know that your worth does not change just because someone else cannot see it. And you do not need a moment like mine. You do not need someone to walk in and say your name for you to be real, for you to be enough, because that truth has always been yours, even when no one around you acknowledged it. And sometimes, the hardest thing is not proving who you are. It is walking away from people who refuse to see you, and trusting that the right spaces will not require you to shrink. And I have learned to listen to that quiet voice inside me, the one that spoke long before that night, the one that told me something was off, even when everything looked fine on the surface. And whether you call it intuition, or faith, or something deeper, I believe it is there for a reason, guiding us toward what is true, and away from what slowly takes pieces of us if we stay too long. So protect your time, protect your energy, protect your sense of self, not with anger, but with awareness, with intention, with the understanding that you are allowed to choose where you belong. And I am still learning, still growing, still figuring out what comes next, but I am no longer questioning my value in rooms that were never meant to hold it. And for that, I am grateful, truly grateful. And if this story stayed with you in any way, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Because sometimes just knowing someone else understands can make the weight a little lighter. So wherever you are, take care of yourself. Share this if you feel it might help someone else. And stay connected if you want to hear more stories like this. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 41 years old. And the one thing I want to leave you with is this. Never let someone else's limited view of you become the truth you live by.